Well, I think this sort of problem of kind of going last is that, there are a lot of smart people who come before you who say everything that you were going to say anyway. So hopefully what I'm going to say would still be something interesting because, a lot of people have gone before who've talked about a lot of interesting issues. So I suppose I have a sort of fairly broad title for my talk, but I'm going to sort of dive into sort of some specific things as we go along. This is a slide that I actually show my students in my first lecture. Okay, so you've got, and I might have said something, Phil is nodding, so you can't give the answer, all right? Okay, there is the Bacton gas terminal, okay, there is Gatwick Airport, and there is a beach in Cornwall, okay? And not considering loss of human life, if you were to protect one of these places, which would be the one you would protect most? Please feel free to shout out.
The gas terminal.
Sorry? The gas terminal? Anybody else? Who thinks we should protect the gas terminal? Raise your hand. Okay, what about Gatwick Airport? Okay, what about the beach in Cornwall? Right. And I suspect that the people who think it's the beach in Cornwall know this because that's where the transatlantic cable comes into the country. And effectively, the country's internet backbone runs through. So, in fact, this answer came when I asked somebody in government as to what kept them awake. And they said that's what kept them awake because they were worried what would happen. Because although with all the satellite link-ups, there is not enough capacity, okay, for us to cope with all the sort of transactions that we do on the internet on a regular basis. So in many ways, the country would come to a standstill. So that's the one that you need to be worried about. Okay. Okay. So and why? Why is all this? I mean, it is because we are now living in this digital world where in the past, this has gone. This is the problem of sort of transferring a presentation from a Mac onto a PC. Okay. So I'll try and talk through it. Okay. When I first started working with computers, people used to talk about cyberspace and people used to talk about physical world, and the two really didn't intersect as much, apart from the fact that you sat in a room on a computer and played some video games. Okay, so but now really, these things have effectively merged. Okay, we do a lot of our business online, we interact with people online. Online social media have sort of brought people together, but raised interesting, provided both interesting business opportunities, but also raised interesting security concerns. So I don't like to think that there is now a cyberspace, and this is a very odd thing to say. I don't like the term cybersecurity because it basically implies that it's different from any security that we do. In fact, really, we live in a digital world and we have interesting problems of security in that digital world. People like to call it cybersecurity, but it is not just about what happens online. It's in fact our online and offline behaviors that contribute to security issues in this digital world. And digital communities are now really the norm. People interact with each other online on a regular basis, either on a personal level or at a business level. Okay, I'm sure pretty much all of you here are probably members of LinkedIn and places like that. So we interact with people, professionally online as well as personally on things like Facebook. And internet is really now pervasive. This is an old statistic. Probably somebody has a newer statistic. But back in 2009, already 70% of households in the UK had access to the internet. And with sort of mobile devices like these, you now have access to information and data on pretty much anything, anywhere, and at any time. I was only a couple of days ago having an interesting conversation with my wife about how it would be nice if our fridge could have an embedded calendar, because every time we have to synchronize the family calendar, we have to open a device like a laptop or a mobile phone or a tablet to try and do that. It would be nice if we could just, while we were sitting in the kitchen, kind of type on the fridge. So it's everywhere, and we are accessing information on anything. However, this leads to the interesting what's known as the dual-use dilemma. Technology that is created for good can also be used for harm. In fact, there are sort of people around the world who basically go, look at a new technology and go, great, I can use it to get in touch with family or do interesting business. And there are people who go, actually, I could use this technology to do some really, really naughty things. And that's really the problem that you find in the digital world. Digital communities do provide great opportunities, but they also provide support for crime and antisocial behavior. One of the sort of most interesting phenomena that you see is that, in fact, digital communities enable what would be previously disorganized groups to come together and organize themselves because it's so much easier to talk to each other now. Okay? You don't have to go pick up a phone, or you don't have to arrange meetings in covert places. You can actually go and have a little meeting room in Second Life and talk to each other. Okay? But also it provides new ways to access victims. So, for instance, people who sort of work with banks would be quite familiar that there is sort of often quite a lot of interest in people befriending the bank's staff on social networking sites, because that way they get sort of interesting information. And in fact, you can actually access enough personal information that then you can go and call somebody up and actually pretend to be that person to gain access to systems or information directly from the bank. So there are new ways to access victims that weren't really available before. However, policing this is challenging. Okay, there is the huge scale. How do you police the internet? You can't. Is the real answer, because there is so much of data and information out there. Even if you had all the interesting and clever tools and all the processing power, you just simply couldn't do it. But also this second point that sort of a number of speakers today have sort of touched on is the rapidly changing threat patterns. Okay, so you find something, you fix it, but people move on. They find other ways of doing the same thing. And it is not so easy. You're always kind of playing this catch-up. And the international nature, okay? It's no longer the fact that somebody commits a crime and it is here in this country. I missed sort of part of Mark's talk, so, but I suspect that he touched on this, is the fact that, it is really, cybercrime is, an international thing. Okay? And loads of complex things come into play, from a very basic point about jurisdiction to really where actually is the crime taking place. You no longer have to be here to commit a crime in this country. You can actually commit it from China, and that would be perfectly possible. So, I mean, very quickly, some example cybercrime cases, identity theft and financial fraud seem to be, one of the sort of big things that we probably all know about. Here is just an example. Albert Gonzalez, I don't know if many people know of him. He was head of an international ring of 11 hackers that stole 40 million credit cards from US retailers' systems. Okay, this is the extent of information that we actually have online at the moment. He was given a 20-year jail term and, sort of forfeited a lot of sort of nice goodies that he had accumulated for himself. But similar to Tony's example earlier today, it's quite interesting that he was actually a CIA informant while doing that, being paid $75,000 a year. So this is this is an example of hacking. Okay, so I think I guess the key point I'm trying to make is that there is the end product, okay, but also the means to get to that end product. And there is, the usual end product, and there are people try to get to it from different means. So this is one example of identity theft and financial fraud. There is another one where James Stevenson, who was an IT worker at Sainsbury's, basically accumulated for himself using different identities that he created in the system to collect millions of nectar points, okay? And he was caught and he was sentenced to 20 months as well, although it seems rather unfair that, both of them got 20, no, that guy got 20 years, okay. Sorry, I missed that. I thought that would be a little unfair, right? But, I think that's also maybe the difference between the UK and America, because he only stole 70,000, and his extent was, nectar points. But this is insider threats. Okay, so again, identity theft, financial fraud, but coming from an insider threat perspective. This is a very interesting one. You probably heard of this a couple of years ago. It was called Zeus 3. It was a Trojan, okay, and it drained accounts of 3,000 customers of a UK bank. So, okay, you would say 3,000 customers, I don't know how much money they had in their accounts. But the reason I picked this one is not because it sort of drained accounts of 3,000 people. This was a shift in what Trojans did. Okay? Normally, Trojans would just harvest data. This was a transaction performer. Okay? It did the transaction and actually presented the customer with a screen which basically left them none the wiser that they had actually lost money. It presented them the screen as if they had all the money in their account already. But it was behind the scenes performing rather complex transactions. Okay? So again, same outcome, but a different attack. And I suppose this really signifies what we are talking about, sort of changing threats. Okay? The moment you start to understand Trojans and viruses, something new comes along. Continuing, many of you will be familiar with Hajia Mariam Abacha. Now, you might think that this is really, an old thing and nobody uses it anymore. It still comes around on a regular basis in many different shapes and forms. Okay, you would now get sort of emails from HSBC or PayPal. Okay, and this phishing scam is still very, very popular, and people still fall to it. Okay. And go, okay, this is, somebody is trying to give me millions of pounds and I will take it from them. Loads of public information out there, okay? You don't really need to go and try and hack to actually, commit some kind of cyber crime. In fact, again, you might, who remembers the website robmyhouse.com? Okay, I actually know the guys who built it in the Netherlands. And these guys went on Twitter, and people who post their status updates all the time, based on that, they figured out when they weren't going to be at home and posted their full address on their website to say, this is a good time to go and rob my house because I'm not at home. We already put out so much information in public, okay, that somebody doesn't actually need to go and try and hack into systems to get access to that information. But also, there is loads of, other information available publicly. So land registry, all the records are now online. You can easily have access to those records. And ever since the records have gone online, there have been an increasing number of cases of people stealing houses. Okay. And the people who owned the house only became wiser to it when they tried to remortgage and figured out that they were no longer the owners of the house and there was another mortgage already taken out on the house. And that's a big problem for the land registry at the moment. And this is back in 2008, BBC reported that they had actually paid £35 million in compensation to people. And this is still a continuing problem because you can get access to information much more easily than you could before. And of course, people have talked several times about Stuxnet. And you again plan and plan and plan, and again something else comes along, okay, which is you've not seen before, something that can actually physically control industrial control systems. So all this is very costly, of course. Actually, only a couple of days ago, I was reading a report which challenges this figure, but I've chosen to stick with it. So, depending on who do you believe, the cost of cybercrime ranges between $250 billion to $1 trillion a year. Okay, and I suppose people count their beans in different ways, but that is to say that it is substantial. Okay, and in the UK alone, banking fraud in 1 year increased by 132%. And that coincides with a lot of banking services going online in itself. And let's not forget human suffering. Okay, it is, if you are the target of any kind of online crime, it is quite stressful and quite problematic. I actually, I'm going to digress, but I was actually asked by one of the sort of a distant family member to get involved in trying to convince another distant family member that they had been taken in by the Facebook lottery scam. They would refuse to believe, and they were continuing to give these people money to pay some UK tax. Okay, and the person was in financial difficulty, and he kept on borrowing and borrowing to pay into this in the hope that they would get hundreds of thousands of pounds when they weren't going to. And it's only after a sort of a long trace where I managed to convince them that actually the person they were talking to was in Ghana, not in the UK, that they believed that it was a scam. And it left them really, really scarred. So there is loads of human suffering there. The role of identity. Okay, so I suppose that's this maybe slightly different bit that I'm going to talk about, but people have touched on identity before. And I think identity is becoming a very interesting concept now. Now that we live in this digital world, identity has become something very different. How do you know, actually I asked this question at one of the other talks when I first stood up, and I said, how do you know that I am actually Awais Rashid and I am standing here speaking to you? What makes you think that? I could be Joe Bloggs. Okay. Well, but and I think sort of the sort of answer I got at that time was you would have different markers. They said you've been invited by the conference to speak. We can go onto your website, but loads of that you can make up if you really wanted to. Okay, and I think one of the interesting things to do would be to actually try and go and give a keynote at a conference where you don't know anything about the topic, and I think that would be quite perfectly possible. Okay, so identity has changed a lot. People go and look you up on Facebook to try and understand who you are. And you can make a Facebook profile for anything, and then next thing you know, you are a specialist of whatever you want to be. It's very fluid. All of us have multiple identities online. Okay, some intentionally, some unintentionally. We use different online logins for different online transactions purposes. Sometimes we have sort of personal accounts and business accounts and so on and so forth. And it's all very fluid. It's all very different. But while that's an interesting opportunity because we can manage multiple aspects of our lives, this also provides interesting opportunities for people who want to exploit it. Again, you can go and create a Facebook account or a LinkedIn profile for a person who works at Lancaster University or your favorite organization and start to invite people to link into them and be friends with them. And next thing you know, you will have loads and loads of people you're connected to, and you can then enter different systems through those links, potentially, or exploiting some of those links. So identity is this very fluid concept now, but it's also dynamic. It changes all the time. You do loads of things with it, and it's malleable. You can effectively do whatever you want to do. You can be whoever you want to be. So that's really what it has provided. Just sort of giving a very specific example in this place, in this university, we do sort of work on protecting children online, and from people who sort of might be masquerading to be children and in fact are adults and trying to gain trust of children. So we ran a little exercise in schools. Okay, so we sort of did this thing where we asked the children, do they know who they are talking to? And in fact, we've also asked the adults at times, and they can't distinguish either. So it's a Turing test-like experiment where there are sort of 10 people behind the wall. Half of them are adults pretending to be children, half of them are children, and people chat to them in this kind of online social media setting. Okay, and at the end of it, we asked the children, were they talking to an adult or a child? What made them think that they were talking to an adult or a child? And other markers. Interestingly, under 20% of the children could tell that they were not talking to a child. Okay, so in 80% or over 80% of the cases, they all thought that they were talking to children when they were actually talking to adults pretending to be children. So, and there are similar kind of examples in the sort of online romance fraud space, but also people who go and commit financial fraud through sort of identity exploitation. People hide their identities. They can pretend to be somebody that you think that they are when they don't necessarily have to be. So I guess the question is, can you tell who you are talking to? And one of the works that we have been doing, and it is out on one of the sort of stalls, you can have a look, is to really look at the sort of language that people use online. Okay. And one of the sort of interesting things is that you can try to hide who you are, but you can actually have sort of key markers or key signature moves that you sort of inadvertently give away. Okay, so when people speak, they have a particular speaking style. Okay, and similarly, when people talk online, they have a particular talking style. And while they might try to hide their identity, they might still be using those signature moves. So this spider chart here really effectively is, I'm not going to go into details, it's picking out loads and loads of different characteristics from somebody's language and effectively creating a sort of a language fingerprint of these people. Okay, and then by comparing it with another conversation, you can actually test if that person is who they claim to be, or if they are pretending to be somebody else. Okay, so the clue is really in the language. You can effectively build sort of profiles of users over time. Okay, so they can be profiles of potential suspects or victims. You can do age, gender characteristics. I don't have time, otherwise I would have done a nice demo of picking out people's Twitter accounts and comparing them and telling you what age they might be. One of my favorite ones was when somebody actually asked us to do it without us knowing, on his wife's personal account and the professional account, and then he called her up at the end of the meeting in front of everybody and said, there is good news and bad news. Everybody knows your age now, but they also think that you are only about 54% female. Okay, so because a gender is a binary decision you have to make, so the system is not as accurate, but age-wise you can sort of divide people into age bands and narrow down very, very quickly. And as I said, you can, detect signature moves. You can actually look at, whether somebody signs off always in the same way, or they always say the same thing in response to particular things. And that's something that's involuntary. It's very hard to train yourself to pick that out. Okay? And you can compare these profiles. You can actually compare against the profile you built over time to go, is this the same person? And you can profile different people and go, is this one person hiding behind a different identity, for instance? And you can also do loads of different interesting timeline analysis where you can sort of pick out when somebody mentions specific users, specific names, places, terminology, etc., to try and build a picture of who the person might be. Interesting thing, I gave you an earlier example of kids trying to detect when adults were pretending to be children. On the same data set, you actually get a 94% accuracy. Okay? So this is not, of course, language analysis is not perfect. Okay? There is always the 6%. But in terms of getting an idea and clue about what people might be doing, this is quite an interesting thing. Of course, there are loads of other challenges around identity. Okay? So we earlier said, there is a sort of a fusion of identity between online and offline identities. Actually, what is the relationship between the two? Okay? We saw very positive and negative examples of the role the relationship between the two types of identity plays in the world. The Arab Springs on one side, great force for change. Okay? People did things online that galvanized them into sort of an offline action, which basically led to a whole democratic change in the Arab world, and the London riots, where people basically organized themselves online and went and burned loads and loads of places and engaged in looting. How do the former affect the later? Okay? Can we understand that if somebody is engaging with a particular identity online, they are more likely to go and do something offline than they are less likely to be? That's an interesting question. What is the role of disruptive technologies? Okay? So mobile phones. We talk about ubiquitous computing. We talk about cloud computing. What does this do? Okay? In terms of providing potential opportunities for people to exploit and engage in criminal activities or trying to breach the security of organizations. How many people probably have sort of put a friend's mobile phone on their corporate network when they are around? I mean, I don't know, maybe companies are more worried about this sort of stuff. People come into university and go, hey, I can't read my email. Can you please put my phone on your network? And people do that, okay? And then the next thing you know, you never then revoke that permission. So we've sort of talked about how threat patterns change all the time. How can you understand, what's going to happen in the future? And Mark touched on that quite significantly. And I think that kind of forecasting is extremely important because once the problems that we know today, we're already trying to solve today. Those problems are going to disappear or not going to be our biggest headache anymore. Nobody cares about the brain virus, which was the first virus, but people do care about Stuxnet. But Stuxnet is just what we know now. What's going to happen next? Because people are going to find something around it, and then something else is going to come along. And it's that kind of forecasting is critical to try and understand what we are going to face in the future and maybe try and remain a step ahead. And making the user more security aware. I think it was quite funny that this morning that security dialogue popped up, and then I would bet that every single person in this room has at some point clicked away a security dialogue without reading it. Probably does it all the time. Okay? And I think that's the interesting problem because users are not more security aware. Somehow people think cybersecurity is somebody else's problem. Okay? Because it's always divorced from what we do on a regular basis. But also, it is seen as something that gets in the way all the time. It is a dialogue box that tells you can't do this. Okay? So I think, how can you make users more security aware, but also empower them more? Because in many ways, again, one of the sort of biggest risks that we face is that we have the security people and the users. And the security people don't like the users, and the users don't like the security people. However, the point is, the users are not the problem. They're also a resource. Okay? And similarly, the security people are not a problem. They are a resource. And if the two sides could understand each other, you would have a much better setup for your organization. And related to that is the issue of how do you balance your security needs versus issues such as privacy and ethics. Okay? Your employees are not going to like to be spied upon. Okay? So you can build the most wonderful systems and you can trap all the traffic you like, but if it makes people uncomfortable, then they won't be very happy about it. But also, what about privacy breaches? If you harvest a lot of data from your network, okay, then you can also exploit that data. And who looks at that data? How is that used is quite critical. And those are non-trivial issues. So just to conclude, the world has changed. It really does fit in the palm of your hand nowadays. And that's not an advert for the iPhone. But we must also respond to these challenges and opportunities. Because if we don't understand that the world has changed, we will continue to do what we always do. And we won't be able to solve the cybersecurity problems that we face. Thank you very much.